They stepped out of there, Jesus stepped out of there almost to fulfill, "You shall see my face no more until you shall say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." And we shall once again break that bread in heaven with him to memorialize that tremendous sacrifice that he made for us. The gospel story is summarized in one simple verse, depending on which version you actually take, but it's about 32 to 33 words, and that is, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." That's in John 3:16, and it comes on the heels of him having this incredible conversation with Nicodemus about the new birth. It is a magnificent chapter and ends with John the Baptist's testimony of Jesus. The whole chapter 3 of the Gospel of John tells you this story in a very beautiful way. Let me begin with a brief story that I heard as a young man, and then I will end with another one that carries on actually in a more present tone and a present tense of what this story of God's love means. When I look at this, I've pointed out in many different ways that John 3:16 and a handful of words here, the starting point is filial. For God so loved the world in sending his Son. The giving is unconditional. The reception is built on making it relational. The range is eternal, but the core is judicial. There is a law in operation, starting with the Father, it being filial, all the way to seeing the network and the matrix of a law at work all along. That he so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. When I was a young lad, the story that made the most profound impact on me was a story based on imagination. You may have heard me tell this story in different forms, but it's been many, many years since I ever retold it. And it's the story of a young man from one village who was in love with a woman from another village. He wanted to marry her and have the permission of her parents, but she was tough and resistant towards his love. And finally, one day she said to him in a bizarre way, she said, "You know, I don't believe you really love me more than you love anyone else in this world. I will marry you if you prove your love to me." This is a typical Eastern hyperbole, hyper-Eastern exaggeration, but the Eastern imagination is quite rife out here. So he says to her, "What do you want me to do to prove that I love you more than anyone else?" She said, "Go back home, and I believe you really love your mother more than you love me. If you're willing to take the life of your mother for me, sacrifice her life, I will give you a yea in your proposal to marriage." So he goes home, ponders over this bizarre thing, and says to himself, "How can she even be making such a demand of me?" But in a frenzied moment of anguish and almost trying to prove his point, he takes the life of his mother, and the woman had laid one condition: "You'll have to prove to me that you've taken her life. Bring her heart in your hand to prove to me that my heart is more important to you than hers." Takes the life of his mother, takes her heart in his hand, and he's running across the woods in order to get to this other village. While he is running, he stumbles over some stubble and all of that there and falls on his face, and the heart bounces out of his hand, and he can't find it. And he's rummaging through the dirt and the underbrush, and suddenly sees this heart, finds it, puts it in one hand, stands up, and he's dusting off the dirt of his knees and his chest and so on. And he hears a voice coming out of the heart saying, "Son, are you hurt? Son, are you hurt?" Incredible imagination, typical Eastern form with melodrama. But a young lad hearing that story naturally is pondering, what is the point of this story? And it doesn't take long for you to figure out that a mother's love is so constant that no amount of injury given to her by any child will still diminish the love in that mother's heart for her children. "Son, are you hurt?" That to me encapsulates the magnificence in human terms of what the power of a story is, and points to the greatest story ever told, the story of the Father sending his Son and turning his face away from the agony through which he had put his Son, only to say of you and me, Father, forgive them, because they really don't know what they are doing. This story of love is the enormity of the greatest story ever told. Yes, you see hints of these kinds of things in many other Middle Eastern and Eastern stories, but this one is rooted in history from an eternal perspective of a law that is at work, which C.S. Lewis so wonderfully captured in the Narnia Chronicles. There's a law underlying all of this, but the sacrifice of Aslan, and to demonstrate the love that he had for the children there, and to point out that there's a heavenly Father who demonstrates this kind of love for you and for me. So in the few minutes that I have, I want to just bring to you some up-to-date realities with which we live and show you the supremacy of this love and why it is indeed the greatest story ever told. The terrifying thing at this time in human history is that on our own terms, by naturalists try to tell us that if you go back to the Big Bang and how long that this universe has existed in their own storytelling of naturalism, we are only about 0.0015% of the history of time occupying in this linear mode. We are sort of the last stretch of the cosmic mile. For billions of years, according to them, have elapsed, and we have just come on in this last moment and this last scene. So much preceded all of this, and yet here we are now. In contrast to the scriptures, we are the reason for the creation of this world. We are not here as an afterthought and as the last stretch of this cosmic mile. We are the reason this world was really created, completely different in a paradigm and a story. And the terrifying thing is this, that even though they tell us we have existed for just such a small, minuscule percentage of time, if you look at what is happening in this world and the way we are destroying each other and all the pain we are inflicting on each other, we have lost the notion of ourselves even in this short period of time. Somehow we have desecrated and destroyed what it is that life is all about. Some time ago, a writer from England by the name of David Levy wrote an article which sort of hit the fan, and his article basically says this: people could now be falling in love and having sex with robots within a few decades, even marrying them, according to a British artificial intelligence researcher. In intimate relationships with artificial partners, he argues that current trends in robotics and artificial intelligence mean the leap to humans and robots forming relationships is not far away. Once robots become more like humans, David Levy believes romance between the two and even sex and marriage will be possible between a human being and a robot. He says also that though he is as an international master in chess, he believes that robots will soon appear so like humans in the way they look and act, in their personality and how they express emotions, that many people will fall in love with robots. His predictions are based on his analysis of certain trends on what he sees as the inevitability of how they will continue in the future. One trend looked at was how the objects of human affection have slowly expanded beyond other humans, firstly to animals, then to virtual pets, and even to robotic dogs. His thesis is this, that soon it will extend to robotic people as well. Virtual reality. You've got virtual dogs, you've got virtual this, virtual that. I would love to know when he writes his book whether he's willing to accept a virtual check or whether he would want a real one in its place. Just imagine, this is what has happened to us in the reality, in this few moments of the cosmic smile, as they say. So not only is it terrifying, it is ironic that the more we understand the marvels of matter and our earthly home, the less we seem to understand the very purpose of life. The more this mystery supposedly is unraveled in the worldly terms and in material terms, the less we seem to have real value about who we are and the marvelous purpose of what life is all about. When Jill planned this conference, she's one of our prides and joys out here. She does a marvelous job in her love for the arts and her love for beauty. And she has a great love for storytelling as well. She's a prolific writer here, writing regularly, week after week, in our Just Thinking. So what I want to do is take one aspect of beauty. We normally talk on 4 themes: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. You take any one of those 4 themes, origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, none of them can ultimately be fully explained without a sense of beauty within them. From the created order, finding meaning and purpose, and how David even realized how beautiful the law was and how precious it was that he drew his delight in the love of the law, that it was made for you and me for our benefit. And then as for our destiny, eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. From origin, meaning, morality to destiny, beauty is implicit in all of those. We see the beauty of a child in our lifetime from the moment of conception, where then the mother begins to feel the movement of that little one in her body and the marvel of the mystery awaiting the arrival of that child, all the way till the day you then give them away in marriage and you see the beauty of a bride or the wonder of a groom receiving that bride. In fact, minutes after my talk is over, I have to head to the airport to officiate at a wedding in Kansas. Our longest serving employee in India, Shalini, her son is getting married tomorrow in Kansas, and I'm to be there for the rehearsal there tonight and then to help officiate at the wedding tomorrow. I can just imagine this little guy, born and cradled in Chennai, India, marrying this young gal from Kansas, thousands of miles apart, and tomorrow they come together to celebrate this wonderful picture of a man committing himself to a woman. One of the aspects of the ceremony that she wants me to make sure we do, in India they call it the thali ceremony. It is a necklace. The groom doesn't just give a ring, he also gives a necklace. It is him committing to her that this adornment that you wear around your neck is my commitment to you, that I will embrace you and hold you and treat you as that great treasure. Just like the priest of old wears that clerical collar saying he belongs to God, this necklace around the neck of that young gal given by the bridegroom is a commitment that they really belong to each other in the wonder of service. Love is a beautiful thing. From origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, the central theme of the scriptures is really the love of God, very unique in the gospel. So I want to race through that, the supremacy of love. And the first thing I say to you, love is supreme in its reach. Love is supreme in its refinement. It's supreme in its reach, how we reach across miles, how we reach across time, how the memories of love extend across so many chasms and so many barriers. Billy Graham's brother-in-law is a man by the name of Leighton Ford. And one day we were sitting at the O'Hare Airport in Chicago. Leighton's a big, tall gentleman. He's married to Billy's wife, to Billy's sister, Jeannie. And Jeannie is Leighton Ford's wife. They've been married many, many years. In fact, Jeannie spoke at her brother's funeral when Billy's funeral was held recently. Jeannie's a lovely gal. But he was talking to me about his own life, Leighton, and how what Billy meant to him and how he became like an older brother and how when he met Jeannie, his life took on new meaning. But he says, Ravi, the thing that I want to tell you that shaped my life most was the fact that I found out that I was really an adopted little boy, and I did not know who my mother was. And for decade after decade, he searched for who his mother really was. Finally, he tracked her down to St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. Through all the methods that you have these days, he was able to find her. And he made that trip on a snowy day, landing in Toronto, getting into a car and driving to St. Catharines. He had contacted her and told her that he had found her. Would she be willing to meet him and see him? She was stunned. She said, "I would love to see you, son." And so he got into the car and drove. It's about a 75-mile journey, but the snow took much longer. He said, "I arrived in this neighborhood with the snow so drenching those streets and wondering what it was going to be like." He was in his 40s at this time. So he pulls up in the street and he's looking for the street number in that biting cold. He didn't have to look for the street number. He saw a woman standing under the tree, waiting, looking out for this car to come up the road. And as he paused and looked, sure enough, she looked also, peered, waved him into the driveway. He said, "I'll never forget the day I finally met her for the first time. I'd been given away as an infant child and was wanting so much to know a little more about my mom." So there they sat around the kitchen table. She was shocked to find out he was an evangelist, even more shocked to find out he was the brother-in-law of Billy Graham. And finally, when he was leaving her in the driveway, put his arms around her and he said, "Mom, what can I do for you? Is there anything I can do for you?" And the tears started to run down her face. She said, "Yes, you can." He said, "What's that?" She said, "Just love me. Just love me." The reach of love across 4.5 decades, from a man who had become one of the most eloquent preachers of our time, in search of his roots and the womb that had brought him forth into this world. Love has an enormous reach. It can reach across time, reach across miles. It'll reach across the flames that might threaten you if a parent is trying to rescue the child. It'll reach out to lift a weighty car to rescue somebody, even who's not near and dear to you. We do those things because that's the supremacy of love in the enormity of its reach and the greatest gap that was ever crossed. God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Why do we love like this? Why? In fact, if you were to ask a Buddhist to explain this desire, nirvana, the monk will tell you, is to renounce this desire. Stop desiring. And that's what will give you your nirvanic hope. And even when you talk of moksha, release in the pantheistic worldviews, it's to be released from desire, released from any of these things. And yet Jesus tells us we are to desire, to hunger and thirst after righteousness. And the most righteous thing is the purity of love that is bound by the moral law that God gives to you and to me. The supremacy of love, the enormity of its reach, and in its refinement. I don't have time to expand all of this. But then you come to the selflessness of love. How love becomes so unselfish in the process. You know, the truth of the matter is when you hold the young maiden's hand and pledge, "I do, I do, I do," you don't really realize how much you're going to have to do the rest of your lives. You just say it. You do and do and do and do. But whether we like to admit or not, there is a degree of selfishness in that. I desire to love this person. I desire to be embraced by this person. And then two adults walk life by life, stride by stride together. There is a degree of selfishness in this. But when a woman gives birth to a child, you see the beginning of total sacrifice, complete sacrifice. Even just this week, our daughter and her husband are in Europe. She has 4 of them. I don't know how she manages, frankly. The oldest is 6, and then there's a babe in arms. You know, every time a person with 4 children comes into the plane, I start praying. because I'm very selfish. I say, is this going to be a longer journey than I had in mind? And yet you watch the mom. Amazing. There was one such flight, and this child was screaming most of the flight, probably really being bothered in the ears. It just seemed like a scream of pain. And everybody, of course, turning around, which the mother sure appreciates, I'm sure, to see that. And at one point, I got up from the aircraft, from where I was sitting, and I was walking to the back of the plane to the restroom, and I was walking right past the seat where this woman was with her child. And the child was leaning on her breast. And the woman had her head down, and the tears were running down her face. What do you do? How do you manage this? You can't get out of that aircraft. You're carrying that little one. Will that in any way diminish the love of this mother for the child? Absolutely not. It's one of the most selfless things that you can do. Love has its supremacy, but love also has its selflessness.
From the audience here, and then we have questions that have come in online as well, and are being voted on. But we have a very serious question that's been posed to you, Ravi, first to start. And that question is, dear respected Ravi, was the Indian restaurant across the street in answer to a specific prayer request that you made?
Well, when we get to heaven, we'll find out. But for here, it's a little bit of heaven on earth.
All right.
That's great.
Great. Well, we'll start with one of the questions which has been most voted for by the online audience, and then we'll go to a live question after that. If you do have a live question, feel free to head just to the microphone here in the middle of the room. So the first question for you both, feel free to answer, whoever would like to. American Christianity seems like a faith dulled by affluence and comfort. Is it possible for us in the U.S. to experience God in a similar way to the other stories that we heard today? And how could we do that?
Well, I'm sure Franz would want to add too with a lot of his travel. I think there are two ways to look at it, Vince. That would be my initial take, as I've just heard the question. On the one hand, it's easy to come down hard, on something like this. It's sort of a easy game and an easy target. But there are two sides to that. The fact of the matter is, it is easy to get too comfortable in what we have. It's not just because it's American Christianity, but it's the way we live in America. Things are more accessible and actually, in many ways, more affordable. You're talking about restaurants, talking about automobiles, talking about homes and accessibility to all of the gadgets of our time. Yes, it is possible, but that's not just America. That's possible in many parts of Europe as well. So it's easy to start climbing up the wrong tree and looking for the fruit on that tree and thinking you have all that you need. Let me switch the metaphor a bit first and then get back to this. On the other hand, very few parts of the world today would really have heard the gospel the way they have if it weren't for American generosity as well. That's really an often forgotten thing. I'm one of those who was blessed by the giving in Canada and the United States. I came to know the Lord in India, but there were missionaries from Canada and the United States there who reached my parents, who reached us. And that's because the people here have grown up with an attitude of giving. That's one of America's greatest gifts. In fact, sometimes a gift that's almost abused. We don't even think to what it is we are giving. We just see a need and start giving without demanding accountability at the same time. So it's been a generous heart. If you look at the work, for example, in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and all of those countries where the missionaries went from here, again from North America, the seeds that were sown. I was in Vietnam in March in Ho Chi Minh City. And Margie and I, that was the first time she was there. I was there in the 70s during the war. And there was a gentleman showing us around, and he was talking about how tough life is for some in the city, how all right it is for the others. And so I looked at him and I said, are you familiar with Tin Lan? Tin Lan, literally, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly with the kind of accents they have and so on. But it means good news. And I belong to the Christian Mission Alliance, and the CNMA churches there were called Tin Lan. They were the major evangelical Protestant church of Vietnam. So I just said to him, "Are you familiar with Tin Lan?" And he looked at me rather shocked. He said, "My grandfather used to attend a Tin Lan church. My father attended, and I grew up in a Tin Lan church." Just a person out of the blue, you know. And there are graves in Vietnam because of American missionaries. I've seen them on the DMZ in Yilin, Quang Tri, and so on. They were the ones that were the last ones to leave. They were airlifted out of the embassy there. The work in Cambodia, great work, and then Canadian missionaries as well. So they have done a lot across the decades. Our role may be changing now. Our role may not be so much in doing evangelism as enabling evangelism, because there are a lot of fine crop of nationals and other possibilities. So yes, it is possible for us to get too comfortable, but I also want to say a big thank you for the way this country has supported the cause of world missions all over the globe, and we cannot gainsay that side of it. There are also great prayer warriors here. Wherever I go, I see people who say, "We're praying for you." So it could become an easy target to say yes, but the risk is there, always there, whenever you have plentiful in supply. We just have to take it as from the hand of God and not see it as a license to get free of any responsibility.
Yeah, I think of, I think it's Deuteronomy 8, when, God's telling us, you're going to go into this land, you're going to get all this stuff, and here's what's going to happen. You're going to start enjoying it, then after a period of time, you're going to start thinking that you earned it, and you did this for yourself, and you're going to forget your need for me. You're just going to forget about it. There's something about, I can't say it's our fault. I mean, we live in this country, and there are just a lot of comforts that come our way. And I think Scripture warns against some of those riches and how they can deaden you and place your heart to where suddenly you treasure your life here more than the one to come. I mean, honestly, when our brothers from Nigeria were just speaking up here, part of my concern was like, gosh, you live such an amazing, amazing life, what God's done through. I almost was fearful of them being in a position like this, sitting in an air-conditioned room with their suits on, answering questions, being applauded, because it's not the world you come from. And I go, oh, Lord, please don't let this weaken, because it can. And so I prayed for you, brothers, going, please, please, Lord, keep that passion. We need that. And there is something about our culture that can soften us. We know that. And yet, what can we do about it? Does that mean we just resolve and go, well, I live in America, we can only go so far in our walk with the Lord because we're not persecuted? Absolutely not. But there are things we need to do, just even in our own prayer lives, when Scripture says, to be sober-minded and self-controlled for the sake of your prayers. That thought of being clear-minded rather than filling your mind with mindless texts and Facebook posts and videos and movies, and so where it's time to pray and we have all these comforts and all these things we can enjoy, and now it's time to pray and to be sober-minded. We're like, our mind is going everywhere and we lose touch with reality, and that's the problem. That's what keeps us from some of this depth and this time with the Lord. I see it. I feel it slipping away. And again, I love what you said about thinking about everything the country has done in a good way. And I personally, too, I want to apologize if I ever come across like I'm just mad, like, gosh, we're so messed up. But it's hard sometimes when you go other countries, and what I've learned is, okay, we've been privileged to see a lot of that, and meet people, saints, dear saints around the world that have suffered so much for the gospel that it just gets us so excited to want to be like them. And not everyone has that privilege to see that and experience that and to feel their pain and see their intimacy with Christ. And so sometimes in coming back here, I just wanted to let people know what is possible. And I really believe it is possible here. But our comforts and our riches really do fight against us in our quest for that.
Thank you guys so much. That's if that's mad, you're welcome to get mad at me anytime. Yeah. I have a T-shirt which Ravi's daughter bought for me, actually. Oh no, it was Margie. It was Ravi's wife, Margie, bought for me, and it says, "I'm not yelling. I'm just Italian." So that's.
You know what I like about Francis? His passion makes me feel like I'm sliding into oblivion. He's like a conductor and the whole world is his orchestra. Love that. Absolutely love it. I used to be like that. Then I got older. Yeah. Can I say one more thing on that? Just so that we don't lose the ideals for all of us. There are parts of the world that don't have too much, Vince, as you well know, and we travel. But they have their own issues. They really have their own issues. There are so many pockets of division in some parts of the world in the church. They're so divided. Everybody, they say when the tide is low, every shrimp has its own puddle. And you've got all these little puddles all over the place. And we are so divided. Maybe the greatest need for the hour is that we be one in our belief and in our passion and in our propagation. Yes. The parts of the world you go to the Middle East. I mean, the tensions within the Christian community there are pretty bad. All little pockets of critiques and criticisms and all of that. Satan works in different ways. Here he may use our well-being in order to mitigate the force of the gospel. There he may use that sense of autonomy to drive a wedge into somebody else. The enemy of our souls is pretty shrewd and knows what to use with which to attack a local setting of the gospel. Yep.
Great. Thanks to you both. Do we have a live question that we can go to here? Okay, anyone who has a live question? Oh, great, is this coming up? Yeah, go. Yeah, we'll do one more question here, but go ahead and talk with Ruth. And anyone else who has a live question, you can just head right here and talk with Ruth, and we'll get to those questions soon. One more from the Pigeonhole guys. This question says, the Gospel of John says we will be known by our love, yet our culture has redefined love to be something we can't tolerate. How do we discuss the definition of love with love?
And that may be the challenge of the hour for us, because we have, our persecution here is of a different kind. It's not so often where our homes may be surrounded by physical threat, but there's a lot of emotional pressure put on our children and on our families and on our values. The way culture is weighing in on almost every issue seems to be contra Christian faith, anything but the Christian faith. But I think this lends itself to the expression of love and grace. As you well know, Vince, and the rest of my colleagues, and of course Francis does this so much in his preaching and in his pastoral work and in his books, we have no option. The option is really either to communicate the gospel effectively or lose the impact of the gospel. Yeah. The option for us should just be one. And you and I well know, so often questions are asked in a very intimidating way or a counter worldview way. And the temptation is to fly off the handle and to fight back and to resist. And we have to I tell my colleagues, we're not answering a question, we're answering a questioner. And we remind ourselves that when you're answering a person, you literally and figuratively are putting your arms around them. You have to draw them close. You have to make them feel you really care about them, that this is not just a mechanistic response you're giving, but your interest is that in their hearing They hear how much you really care about them. Once upon a time, the questions were rather theoretical. You could get away with theoretical answers, but a lot of questions today have very many practical implications. They are much more existentially driven and experientially dense. So our challenge is to make them realize that while our worldview may be different, the imperative of our worldview is to love those who oppose and love those who stand against us. So love has to extend itself in the way you answer, and love has to extend itself in the availability you have for the person to a continued dialogue on the same issue, so that you can demonstrate that love over a period of patience and over a period of time. That's the way I would see it.
Yeah, when I look at what is written in John, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." And so the love in that passage anyway is talking about this, about it's true that, like, the people in the world, if I confront any type of sin in their life, they would see that as unloving. There's nothing we can do about that. That's just the way they have redefined love. But what we can control is in the church, that we are honest with one another. But he says the way that they're going to know that you're my disciples is this, and this is where we're losing it. You talk about the other countries that are dividing in their different denominations and believers at each other's throats, which I've seen also. But gosh, are we known for our love for one another? And what are we doing right now to pursue this oneness that Christ wants of us? I said this at the luncheon earlier. Man, I love this man. The first time we met, I don't even remember when it was, but I remember maybe it wasn't the very first time, but I remember just one time because, okay, I'm not an apologist. Most of you guys know that. Okay, I'm just, I've tried, it's like my mind goes so far. And so I need brothers like this so badly. It used to be back in the 90s when a pastor felt like he just had to be everything. I got to know more than everyone else, but now it's just like, okay, I can't do it all. I'm not going to be the best Bible teacher or the best scholar and the best counselor and the best leader and the best apologist. So I need this. But a lot of times when I encounter someone who is a scholar, I get intimidated. I think a lot of us do. We just feel stupid, right? And usually they'll tell us why we are stupid, and they'll like, yeah, I knew it, and you just proved it to me. I already knew that. Tell me something I don't know. And so, but I remember, one of the times, Ravi, it might have been our first time meeting, and we were both going to speak in an event, and he just comes up to me and just hugs me and tells me how much he loves me and thanks God. I think he just started praying, God, it is such an honor to share the stage with this man. Francis, I'm so honored to be on the same and do you know what that does for a person who's already feeling insecure and everything else? And then him saying, no, I'm honored to be with you. Your contribution to the body of Christ, like a father, like love. It was so foreign to me to be loved by a scholar, seriously, and valued by one. Now, the fact that feels so foreign is an indictment of where we're at. And I get it, and I want to be the first to apologize. Like, I can get so fired up about my thing that it may seem like I'm mad at you. I'm not, okay? I just get fired up about stuff, and I get bothered when I know how much people are suffering around the world. And I think about people who've never heard the gospel. And sometimes in my zeal for something, I forget that my number one call is to love you deeply. like for this oneness. And the Bible's saying when that happens in the church, that's when the world's going to know that we're his disciples, and that's what we need to fight for.
We've got a nice line of questions here live, so let's go and focus there for a bit.
Thank you for this. I come across an article the other day where 56% of Christians in America, in my generation and above, believe that Jesus is God. The rest of it, they believe that Jesus existed historically, and they believed that he was a good moral teacher, but they didn't believe he was God. And then as I read further in the article, the generations below us, only about 38% believed that Jesus is God. They believed he existed historically, was a good moral teacher. And so when I read that, I kind of look at where we are in America today and maybe why we are the way we are, because we're not seeing Jesus from who he is as God. And as a pastor, hopefully pastoring many more years here in the future, what am I going to do to convince the generations that are up and coming the divinity of Jesus Christ, which I think will help us get back to where we need to be as a country? And thank you.
Where do you want to go with that?
If you just fix the country, Ravi, then it'll be fine. Yeah.
I didn't get the first statistic was, did I hear 56? Okay, and now it's far below that. Actually, even that surprises me. I wonder whether those that higher percentage have thought through of what they're really saying. The divine Son of God, the authority that title would give to him, and therefore the imperatives that necessarily follow. When people talk about him as being a good moral teacher, that's always the most puzzling description of all. You wonder whether they have, I think, who was it? Becky that said this morning about people who had never even read the gospel but commenting on it and taking implications from that. If they really believe, if even 56% at that time believed that Jesus was the Son of God, then we didn't do a very good job of spreading that message and defending that message. But if they talk about him being a good moral teacher, then maybe his good moral teachings they actually consider bad because they don't like to abide by the moral teachings that Jesus had. I would say that it tells you and me more and more that in our preaching, one way or the other, we have to be bringing in the teachings of Jesus and why those teachings are true and why he is indeed who he claims to be. So that apologetic becomes very important at a time like this. Oftentimes I find when you're, for example, in the presidential prayer breakfast and all, there's more and more of this move of having a pluralistic type of prayer and people from other places having equal voice at the prayer breakfast, which doesn't often uphold the Christian faith and Christian values. So I would say that it is important, my voice is giving me trouble here. It is important for us, I think I saw some water here. Mm-hmm. Give me a moment.
I'll do that for you, Rob.
Thank you. It is important in our speaking, teaching, and writing to defend who Jesus is and why he is so. So oftentimes I will say to people when they are attacking Christendom or Christianity, and there's a lot to attack historically, I'll say, tell me what you think of Jesus. What is it you really think of Jesus? And when they start pondering that, it opens up an awful lot of possibilities for a genuine witness for the birth, life, death, and resurrection. It is interesting in Matthew 16 when Jesus has spoken to Peter, and Peter has finally recognized, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said, "Flesh and blood has not revealed that to you, but my Father who is in heaven." As soon as he makes that recognition, the Bible says from that moment on, Jesus began to teach about the manner of death that he should die, and Peter resisted that. So he just accepted who Jesus was, then begins to challenge the path that Jesus was actually about to take. And Jesus, from taking that compliment, "Flesh and blood has not revealed that to you, but my Father who is in heaven," and then he turns around and now says to him, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You're not minding the things of God, but you're minding the things of men." So even those who recognize his deity had a difficulty in understanding the total message and the mission. So you move on to the next chapter, okay? 17 there in Matthew, if I'm not mistaken. So at the end of 16, Jesus says there are some who are standing here who will not taste death till they see the glory of the Son of God coming in glory. And the very next chapter is the Mount of the Transfiguration. So he takes them up to the mountain, and Peter and James and John are stymied by this glimpse of a transfigured Lord and Elijah and Moses. And after all of that exhilarating experience, Peter said, "Let's stay right here." Peter the fisherman wanted to become Peter the builder. He said, "I'll build 3 tabernacles here for all of you." And Jesus basically says, "We've got to go down. There's work to be done." This Peter, who experienced probably one of the most exhilarating encounters the human eye could ever have accommodated, imagine being present at the transfiguration of our Lord. He has seen this, the most exhilarating thing, and to see Moses and Elijah at the same time. This Peter tells us in his epistles to set apart Christ in your heart as Lord and always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you to anyone who asks, and do that with gentleness and respect. He gives us the definitive statement of what apologetics is, meaning any experience has a shelf life. Because he says, "For now we have the word of the prophets made more certain." We were eyewitnesses to his majesty, but now we have the word of the prophets made more certain, and you'll do well to pay heed to it as to a light in a dark place. So all of the experiences were given a secondary place. The propositional truth of Christ was given the primary place because it is eternal, and the presentation of Christ as the centerpiece in answering all of the questions became the mission, I think, of Peter himself. So I would say, as wonderful as our experiences are, we have to go back to the sure word of prophecy, "For thy word abides forever." Expository preaching is the most powerful way to present who Jesus Christ really is.
Yeah, I obviously echo that. But I was going to say the same thing, but I actually was thinking that the same line of like, we have to be so careful with understanding what the Holy Spirit of God does, and only He has that power to do. You know, Peter's confession was like, okay, I didn't convince you of that. That came from heaven. That was a miracle that you believe that I am the Son of God. So we just have to be so careful not to think. That's where apologetics has its place, and then there's a stopping point to it. And we go, oh God, please, please, because it's the Spirit. The natural man's not going to get that Jesus is the Son of God. It just doesn't happen that way. Heaven has to reveal it. And so we're on our faces begging God, please, please. Because then when the Holy Spirit does that thing in your heart, then it's like, my sheep will hear my voice. They'll listen to truth. They'll actually accept the truth of who Jesus is. But on top of that, too, I think there's almost a casual attitude about Jesus because of maybe not necessarily false teaching in the church, but incomplete teaching in the church, where we may overemphasize certain things about Christ because we want to get people interested in Him. But in many ways, it can create like a casual attitude toward His deity. I was thinking about in John 5, verse 27, when, 22, the Father judges no one, but he's given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. To just read the Word of God to someone who's casual about, well, maybe Jesus that. It's like, okay, let me explain something. I grew up in a church where I just assumed, oh, Jesus is so sweet, and God the Father, oh man, it's hit or miss. Old Testament, right? And to read, no one read verses like this. That do you realize that all judgment is from the Son? Really? I remember reading Revelation 6 when in verse 15, the kings of the earth and the great ones, the generals, the rich, the powerful, and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Like, it was me reading this book and going, whoa, this is Jesus? He's the judge? Whoever talks about the wrath of the Lamb? And yet here's everyone on the planet terrified, just wishing they could be hidden because they can't. It's because we're not being complete. And that I think sometimes we can have a casual attitude about the deity of Christ and who Jesus is, because we see him as so, it's almost like a side note to God. And absolutely, that's not the way the scriptures teach about him. And I'm still a guy who believes that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it's when you fear Jesus, the coming judge, that suddenly you recognize, wow, but he's also full of mercy. Wait, how could that, such a terrifying God of justice and wrath, also be a God of mercy? And you just, your mind just starts spinning, and you're in awe of him all over again.
Thank you guys. It's so good. And as I was thinking about your question and what you guys have shared, and Francis, just what you were saying about how apologetics can only go so far, but the Holy Spirit has to be the one that brings someone to believe in the divinity of Christ. It's just so true. And I was just, you spoke about the younger generation. I just had in my mind a picture of this young woman who came to faith on a mission that we did. And there wasn't necessarily some big obstacle in her way. We asked her a few days later, we said, why didn't you say yes to Jesus sooner? And she was very thoughtful about it. And she just sort of leaned back in her chair and she said, I think I just needed an invitation. And that line has always stuck with me. So we see those percentages dropping from 56% to 30-something%. Let's turn the question around to ourselves as well, and let's make sure that the percentage of people we're actually inviting to believe in the divinity of Jesus is very, very high. Because if we believe Romans 1 and we believe that people genuinely know God, they do know him. That truth is just suppressed. It's in there. Every single person could be just one invitation away from giving their life to Christ. Let's make sure that the reason that percentage is so low, whatever the reason is, it's not because that's the percentage of people that we're inviting to believe that truth. Let's go to another question live.
Thank you. Postmodernism seems to have produced a political system that's based on identity politics, which is based off of oppressed versus oppressor. And it seems that there's a large part of our culture that views Christian faith as the oppressor. And our American church seems that in some ways it has compromised itself to avoid the label of being the oppressor. And my question is, how do we unify the church in our culture when our culture views our beliefs as oppressive without compromising our convictions?
The last line again, please. I'm sorry. When our culture doesn't?
How do we unify the church when our culture views our beliefs as oppressive without compromising our convictions?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the flow of I'll leave the closing words for you on this, Francis, so let me take the first part of it here. You're looking at, the word is epistemology in philosophy. The word epistemology means, how do you, it's the subject of dealing with how do you know something is true. So if you're dealing with a historian, he has a different epistemological grid. A historian will look for various documentation in order to see whether his philosophy of history and his facts of history are right. You talk to a scientist, he or she works with a different series of tests for truth and so on. So whether it's a historian or a philosopher or a scientist, they have their own grid of truth testing. The Lord also tells us to test the truth, to prove it to be right. Look at where secular philosophy has gone, from rationalism, reason alone, to empiricism, science sort of being the ultimate arbiter of everything, to existentialism. Your experience is the final test. So you move from rationalism to empiricism to existentialism, and then what was left? Postmodernism. Postmodernism repudiated all of those. No truth, no meaning, no certainty. And fascinatingly, by the way, all of these had their seedbeds in the continent, in Europe, coming from there, from the rationalistic view and so on. America had a different starting point, as did the United Kingdom. Their starting point was not reason, their starting point was moral reasoning. This has been pointed out by Gertrude Himmelfarb in her book, Roads to Modernity, Professor Emeritus from Columbia University. So while Europe went from rationalism all the way down to postmodernism, America's starting point was moral reasoning. That's why we talked about being endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. The problem is now we have an America that deals with rights without ever defining what is right. We have no more the moral reasoning on which to arrive at all of this. So I think the last bastion of this that is left, as far as I'm concerned, you can go to scientific proofs, you can go to design proofs, you can go to so many other things. But the average person who really opens up their eyes and is listening to you recognizes there has to be a moral framework with which I do my thinking. What is it that makes me a person or a creature of value? So in that essential nature is the image of God. The image of God gives to me moral reasoning. We cannot communicate truth while compromising the implications of truth. So I would say how you communicate in this society is conviction with compassion. Convictions are very different to opinions. Opinions are something that you hold to. Convictions are those which hold you. You can change an opinion. One time you might like blue, next year you might like green. It's okay. But you cannot change your convictions about the sacredness of life or the sacredness of sexuality or love and those that you put into this category. The challenge for the Christian is how to communicate conviction with compassion. My mother used to say, once you've cut off a person's nose, there's no point giving them a rose to smell. So we have these issues come up on the university floor all the time. If they know you really care about them and they know you're authentic in what you are saying, you can't often go directly to the answer, but you can circle and form an arc and come into it. When Billy Graham was in his heyday, the invitation was given to the masses. But now we've got the hard picking to do. Not everybody is ready in that kind of setting. So we have to find ways of dialogical thinking, ways of rational discourse, and I could say much more, but I don't want to eat up the clock here. Let me give it to Francis to say the rest here.
Yeah, let me complete your thoughts for you. I just love when he quotes people where I'm like, Gertrude Himmelfarb or whatever. Like, wow. I look over at my daughter. She's just like laughing over there. My dad doesn't know what he's talking about. And I do know the word epistemology, though. I do. You probably think I didn't. It comes from the word pistis for faith. Thank you. No. That's all I have to say.
Which works very well because we're almost out of time, but I would like to take one more question live.
Did you finish your thought?
I do have a thought. Okay.
Okay, all right.
It's because, okay, here's where I feel like I can contribute. Okay. You know, it's this war. I mean, you described it perfectly. We this whole idea of we're all fighting for our rights. And these are real things, real pain, real things that we feel. It's so close to home, and I love how the church has been so compassionate towards people. This has been a new move into this really trying to understand people, hear where they're coming from, but it really does come down to this worldview at the core. I've been saying recently that I think one of the most important passages for our generation is Isaiah 55, starting in verse 8, where God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So we've kind of, a lot of our reasoning comes from, and I read a lot of I've read a couple of modern books where they'll just say, well, why would God do this? I wouldn't do it. That's not the way I think. You know, well, I wouldn't flood the earth either. I wouldn't do this either. But it's coming from this mindset where, you know it or not, that you believe your mind is the ultimate. And what God's saying is, I don't think like you. You know, so I read the Old Testament, and so many times I go, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. Exactly. He says there's a reason, because you don't think like I do. And so in this compassion for people, we've lost this understanding that, yes, I feel you're hurt, but my biggest concern is you're not seeing the center of it all. And you're not seeing this being who's so far beyond you that you have to answer to. And that's bigger than the hurt that you're currently facing. And his thoughts are so far beyond ours. And there needs to be a way in which the church no longer apologizes for the way that God thinks and acts and what he says is right and wrong.
We should probably end. I want to say, I meant to say earlier to the gentleman who raised the question, secularism, going through all of those isms that I mentioned, ended up with postmodernism. What the mistake is there in each one of those cases, I want you to hear me carefully now, in grabbing the finger of one discipline, they thought they had grabbed the fist of reality. There is a place for rationalism. There is a place for the existentialist thought. There is a place for the empirical. There is a place for postmodernism. One thing in defense of postmodern thinking, they believe in community, which is precisely what the church is really all about. It is only the Christian worldview that distributes its authority between all of these methods, because they all have a place, but the fist of reality ultimately is precisely the reasoning of God himself, who has the rational aspect, who has the existential aspect, who has the community aspect, who has the investigative empirical aspect. So while secularism was going to one ism at a time, God's probably sitting there saying, you just got one little sliver of truth here. I've got all of these in my orb. And when you put it together, it has a cohesiveness of a composite and a worldview that fits together with all of these having their legitimate place.
Yeah, that's good. That's some good epistemology. One final question. We're just about out of time, but please do go ahead.
Thank you. So I come from a immigrant background from Russian Ukrainian churches, and so what we have is the older generation who sees America, unlike the brothers here that were sharing, they see America as synonymous with the world. And then we have the younger generation who is seeing all of the value in everything that American churches can bring, as I'm seeing here as well. And I'm kind of stuck in the middle between those generations. And so for me, the question is, how can I be a peacemaker between those two generations? Because that is a problem that we are having in our churches, is a separation of those generations, a misunderstanding between them.